Hello everybody, Jeremy Dickinson here. In this video I want to spend some time talking about an argument by a philosopher named Alvin Plantinga. He's a contemporary philosopher who's argued for the claim that we are not our bodies. The argument has come to be known as the replacement argument. Now, before I dive into Plantinga's argument, let me see if I can set the stage a little bit. So in this video I'll set the stage for Plantinga's argument, and then I'll discuss the argument. And then in a following video, part 2 of my video on Plantinga's argument, replacement argument, I will talk about potential responses to it. Okay, so Plantinga's argument takes place within the context of the philosophy of mind. Now, the philosophy of mind is that part of philosophy that's concerned with trying to figure out the nature of the mind, as could be guessed by just thinking about the name, philosophy of mind. And among the key questions that philosophers of mind ask is whether or not the mind is a purely physical thing. Now, if you hold the view that the mind is a purely physical thing, then you are a physicalist about the mind. You think that the mind is either the brain or some subregion of the brain or something like that. And the opposite view, the view that would have it that the mind isn't anything purely physical or isn't reducible to anything purely physical, is known as anti-physicalism, or we can call, for our purposes, anti-physicalism, or we can also call it immaterialism. So on the one hand, there are philosophers of mind, and this is the dominant position of philosophy of mind, in fact, which has it that the mind is a purely physical thing. It's the brain, it's some part of the brain, it's the interaction of the parts of the brain, or some such view. And on the other hand, there's the anti-physicalist view, which has it that the mind isn't reducible to anything purely physical, including the brain or any subregion of the brain, etc., etc. So those are the two main positions in the philosophy of mind when we deal with the issue about whether or not the mind is a purely physical thing. Now, the most common way of being an anti-physicalist about the mind is to be what's known as a substance dualist. And a substance dualist is somebody who thinks that what we essentially are is a non-physical mind, but we have a physical brain, a physical body, but we have those inessentially, as it were. So the mind is a non-physical thing, and that's what we essentially are, and then the brain and the body, those are purely physical things, and we are not those things essentially. Okay? So that's the most common way of being a substance dualist. This position traces all the way back to philosophers like Plato and Descartes and Alvin Plantinga. His argument essentially is for the anti-physicalist position, but Alvin Plantinga himself is a kind of substance dualist. He thinks that we are essentially our minds as an immaterial thing, but we have bodies, but we are not our bodies. We do not need our bodies to continue existing. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't need some body or other for our minds to exist in, quote unquote. It just means that we are not our bodies. So, according to philosophers like Plantinga and perhaps other substance dualists, the very natural place for a consciousness or a mind to reside, quote unquote, reside here, is in a body. So when Plantinga argues for the claim that he is not his body, or that we are not our body, he is not making the claim that we can exist as disembodied souls or minds that float, as it were, independently of bodies. That would be a separate argument that would be needed. So he just wants to argue for the claim that we are not our bodies. We can exist with different bodies if in possibility. It's possible that we exist with different bodies. Now, of course, a physicalist is going to respond to someone like Plantinga and say that, no, what we essentially are is just a purely physical thing. There's no reason for thinking, or no good reason for thinking, that we are anything beyond something physical. And so this is where an argument is needed. This is where Plantinga's replacement argument comes in. Plantinga wants to develop an argument in support of the anti-physicalist position, which indirectly goes about supporting his substance dualist position. Plantinga assumes we also have bodies, but as we'll see, he's going to say that our bodies aren't essential to what we are. So there we have it. Philosophy of mind. One of the key issues is what's the nature of the mind in terms of of whether it's physical or non-physical, at least in part. And then we have the physicalist answer. We have the anti-physicalist answer. And there are different ways you can be an anti-physicalist, but the dominant way that I want to focus on for the purposes of this video lecture is just substance dualism, because that's Plantinga's position. But there are other ways in which you can be a dualist about human beings and about the mind. So let's see if we can understand what Plantinga's argument is, given this broad sketch of the relevant framework for understanding the argument and where it's situated in the philosophy of mind. So Plantinga's arguing for an anti-physicalism. Now, maybe one last thing before diving into the argument is that when a philosopher argues that the mind is a non-physical thing and is thus an anti-physicalist, very often she's in effect arguing that we are non-physical things. We're not, at least not purely physical things. There's something beyond something physical that makes up what we are. And this is something that goes back to figures like Descartes in the history of philosophy, who he seems to want to equate and thus use interchangeably expressions like soul, the mind, I. Okay, and philosophers like Alvin Plantinga seem to follow neatly in Descartes' footsteps here. So when he argues that he is not his body, or that we are not our body, what he's in effect arguing is that the mind is not something purely physical, and the mind is something that is interchangeable with the I, or with what we are, essentially. Okay, so that's enough of the stage setting. Plantinga's replacement argument, again, attempts to establish the claim that we are not our bodies, and the argument, as I'll begin discussing about it, starts with a premise. And let me talk about the argument in the first person to make this simple, and you just make the appropriate changes when you think about it, such that when we talk about the argument generally, we can say that the argument is for the claim that we are not our bodies. But as I run the argument, I'm going to run it from just the first person, so I'll arrive at the conclusion that I am not my body. But of course, the same is going to hold for you. We chose I arbitrarily here. Okay, so here's the first premise. Okay, I have the property, okay, of possibly existing without my body. So it's possible that I exist without my body is the first premise, and just the way we're gonna express it here is this: I have the property, so it's a property that I have, that I can possibly exist without my body. So the claim here, note, is not that I actually exist without my body. Okay, it's just that it's possible that I do, in the broad sense of logical possibility here. It's logically possible that I exist without my body. Okay, that's the first step. Okay, second step is that my body lacks having this property, the property discussed in the first premise. So what's the best way of articulating the second premise, or expressing the second premise? It's going to be this: my body doesn't have the property of being such that it can possibly exist without my body. Okay? What's going to support that claim, just very roughly, is going to be the idea that nothing can exist without itself. And so premise 2 is just an instance of that principle. If nothing can exist without itself, then my body can't either. Okay. The third premise of the argument is a very straightforward principle. If x and y and let x and y be names for things, if x and y are the same thing, then they share all the same properties. Okay? And we can even make the stronger claim here. X and y, again as names for things, are identical or are the same thing if and only if they share all the same properties. So let that be our principle. X and y are identical if and only if they share all the same properties. So then we can use that principle, we can create an instance of that principle, I should say, the next step of the argument. Step 4. I and my body, let I and my body now be names for things, are identical or are the same thing if and only if they share all the same properties. But now step 5, you've guessed it, from 1 and 2, we can infer that I and my body do not share all the same properties. And since I and my body do not share all the same properties, then we can conclude, step 6, with the claim that I am not my body. But of course the same now holds for you. So we are not our bodies. Okay, that's the argument. The basic idea, the thrust of the argument is just this. If two things in name have distinct properties, then they're not the same thing. I and my body, they don't have all the same properties. They're distinct in these ways. So they're not the same thing. So I'm not my body. So let's go back to the first premise. So I think we need to probably do some unpacking here. The first premise is the claim that I have the property of possibly existing without my body. And perhaps when I was running through the argument, the other premises seemed very straightforward, but this one really stuck. If it did, that's fine, because this is where most of the action is at in this argument. So the premise here is the claim that I can exist without my body. It's possible that I do so. So why should we think that this is true? Well, in order to support this premise, this very key premise, Plantinga develops what's known as the replacement case. And it's through the replacement case that Plantinga thinks that he can show that you can exist without your body. But again, he's not saying that you actually do. He's just saying that's merely possible that you do. So what we're supposed to do is imagine some hypothetical scenario, some logically possible scenario, along the lines of, pigs flying, perhaps, right, or donkeys talking, perhaps. Broadly, logically possible that such things occur. Imagine technology so advanced that it can replace every part of your body. You can go in and get a new designer body whenever you wanted. Look, we already have advanced technology. Now just imagine thousands of years into the future, millions of years into the future, where we've advanced technology even greater than what we have to this day, that we have at this time. And imagine being able to walk in and say, I want this new body, doc. And you go in, and within seconds, you have a new body. And in fact, what Plantinga says is, suppose you could walk in, and you're reading a comic, and you start with one sentence. By the time you get to the end of that sentence that you're reading, you have an entirely new body. Okay, but you remember reading that sentence. There's but a single episode of consciousness that occurs. Now, what I want to do here is pause and have you think about just the bare possibility of having every part of your body, either macro or micro part of your body, changed. Is this possible? What I'm going to do is stop here and then pick up and say a bit more about why Plantinga thinks that this case is possible, and then discuss the rest of the argument, including some responses to it. Okay. Thanks for watching, everybody.